The night my parents disowned me, I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. I was 17 years old. It was a Tuesday. My mother walked in, set down her purse, and looked at me the way you look at something broken you've already decided to throw away. "We know what you did, Maya." I didn't even know what I was supposed to have done. Turns out someone at school, I still don't know who, had spread a rumor that I had stolen money from the church fundraiser. That I was a liar. Thief. The kind of daughter that embarrasses a family like ours. My parents didn't ask me if it was true. They didn't call the school. They didn't talk to my teachers. They didn't look me in the eye and say, "Tell us your side." My father just said, "We didn't raise a criminal. You can stay until graduation, then you're on your own." 6 months later, I moved out with a single suitcase and $240. I was 18 years old. My mother handed me the cash at the door like she was tipping a hotel maid. My father didn't come to the door at all. And that was it. No call on my first day of college. No visit when I was sick and living in a one-room apartment eating instant noodles for 3 weeks straight. No birthday texts. No, we were wrong. Nothing. For 10 years. Nothing. Here's what they didn't know. That girl they threw out. She didn't fall apart. She got angry. The quiet, focused kind of angry that doesn't shout. It studies. It shows up early and stays late. It reads case law at midnight because it has something to prove and nobody left to prove it to except herself. I became an attorney. Not just any attorney, a civil rights litigator. The kind people call when institutions have crushed someone who couldn't fight back. The kind whose name ends up in court records that other lawyers cite. And 10 years after my parents handed me $240 and closed the door, they called me. Not to apologize. To ask for help. Before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, what happened next is the part that will make your jaw drop, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share is about more than just my story. It's about what happens when the people who underestimated you finally need you, and you have to decide exactly who you're going to be in that moment. Let me take you back to the beginning. Wait. Before I take you back to the beginning, before I show you the family dynamics, the favoritism, the years of being treated like I was the problem, I need you to do something. If you've ever been called a liar by someone who never even asked for your side of the story, like this video. Right now. Because this one's for you. And if you've ever been cut off, pushed out, or made to feel like you were the black sheep simply because you refused to shrink, subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell. Because every story I tell here is built for people who were counted out and kept going anyway. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. And tell me this. Has someone in your family ever believed a rumor about you over your own word? Let me know. Because you are not alone in that. Now let me take you all the way back. The Calloway family. That's us. We lived in a mid-sized brick house in a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a flagpole in the front yard my father never let go without a flag on it. From the outside we looked like the kind of family that had it together. The kind neighbors waved at. The kind that showed up to community events and sat in the 3rd pew from the front every Sunday without fail. My father, Robert Calloway, was a regional sales manager for a commercial insurance company. He coached Little League for 11 years, knew everyone at the Rotary Club by first name, and had a handshake so practiced it felt like a signature. He was the kind of man who believed that reputation was the most valuable thing a person owned, and that protecting it justified almost anything. My mother, Diane, taught 4th grade at the elementary school 2 miles from our house. She was warm with her students in a way she rarely was at home. Patient, encouraging, full of gentle praise. Her colleagues adored her. Parents requested her classroom every year. At school she was the person everyone wanted in their corner. At home she was more complicated. Then there was my brother, Brandon. 2 years younger than me. Athletic, easygoing, the kind of kid who walked into a room and immediately made friends with the nearest 3 people. He played varsity football by sophomore year. He had my father's handshake and my mother's smile, and he used both like currency. Teachers loved him. Coaches loved him. Our parents lit up when he walked through the door in a way that I stopped expecting them to light up for me somewhere around middle school. And I was the other one. I was the reader. The questioner. The one who wanted to understand why rules existed before agreeing to follow them. I wasn't difficult, I was precise. There's a difference. But in the Callaway household, precision looked like defiance, and defiance was the one thing my father did not tolerate. He had a phrase he used whenever I pushed back on something. Maya, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I heard it so often it became the background noise of my childhood. Every time I asked for a reason. Every time I pointed out an inconsistency. Every time I said that doesn't seem fair about something that genuinely wasn't. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. What he meant was, agree. Smile. Move on. Be more like Brandon. The favoritism wasn't loud or dramatic. It never announced itself. It lived in the texture of daily life. Small, consistent, cumulative. The way my father went to every single one of Brandon's football games and came to exactly 2 of my academic competitions, both times leaving early. The way my mother bought Brandon a car for his 16th birthday and told me for my 16th that I could use hers on weekends if I asked in advance. The way Brandon's friends were always welcome at dinner with no notice. But I was expected to check before inviting anyone over because your father needs to decompress when he gets home. I remember being 15 and placing second in the state debate championship. It was the highest any student from our school had placed in over a decade. My coach called it historic. I came home with the trophy and a newspaper clipping my coach had given me. My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey." Then she turned back to the stove. My father looked at the trophy, nodded once and said, "Second place." What happened at the end? That was the whole conversation. 2 weeks later, Brandon caught a touchdown pass in a playoff game. My father rented out a room at Applebee's and threw him a party with 30 people. I told myself it didn't bother me. The way you tell yourself a lot of things at 15 when the alternative, admitting that your parents love you differently than they love your sibling, is too large and too painful to hold directly. So I held it sideways. I poured myself into school, into books, into the future I was already quietly building. I decided early that I would not wait for my parents to believe in me. I would build something they couldn't argue with. I was even then thinking like a lawyer. The family dynamic had an unspoken logic to it. Brandon was the heart of the Callaway family story. The athlete, the charmer, the son who would carry the name forward in a way my father understood and recognized. I was the footnote. Present, functional, occasionally impressive, but not central to the narrative they were telling about themselves. I was expected to show up. To participate. To perform the role of the dutiful daughter at holidays and church events and the neighborhood cookouts my father hosted every 4th of July. But I was not expected to need anything from them. Not validation, not advocacy, not the benefit of the doubt. That last part is what destroyed everything. Because when I was 17 and a rumor tore through our church community like wildfire, the benefit of the doubt was the one thing that might have saved us. It started with a church fundraiser, the kind our congregation ran every spring to support a local food pantry. My mother was on the planning committee, which meant our family's involvement was never optional. I volunteered, genuinely wanting to help, and also because I was already building a college application in my head and community service mattered. I was assigned to help count and record the donation envelopes after Sunday service. 3 weeks in a row, I sat in the church office with 2 other volunteers and the committee treasurer, tallying cash and checks, logging everything carefully into a binder. The 4th week, the count came up short. A few $100s. Enough to alarm people. Enough to start conversations. I don't know what actually happened to that money. A miscounted envelope. A logging error. The possibility I've turned over in my mind for 10 years. That someone in that room took it and let the suspicion land on me. I cannot prove any of those things. What I know is this: I was never alone with a single envelope. Every session had witnesses. Every figure I recorded was verified by someone else in the room. None of that mattered. Someone, a woman from the congregation whose daughter had been passed over for the same volunteer position I'd been given, told my parents that I had been acting strangely. That I'd been seen lingering. That I had seemed nervous. That was it. That was the entire case against me. My parents heard it in a church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon. And by the time I got home that evening, the verdict was already in. My mother walked into the kitchen, set down her purse, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, but something worse. Disappointment so complete it had gone cold. "We know what you did, Maya." I tried to explain. I laid out every detail. The witnesses, the process, the fact that I was never unsupervised for a single second. I was precise. I was calm. I made the best argument a 17-year-old who wanted to be a lawyer someday could make for her own innocence. My mother's response: "Why would she make something like that up?" My father said nothing. He got up, walked to his office, and closed the door. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. 6 months later, I was at the front door with one suitcase and $240 my mother pressed into my hand without making eye contact. She didn't hug me. I didn't cry. Not there. 3 blocks away, sitting on a bus bench in the February cold with nowhere solid to go, I let myself feel the full weight of it. My own parents had chosen a parking lot rumor over their daughter. And sitting on that bench, I made a quiet decision. Not from rage, not from bitterness, but from something harder and more lasting than either. I would build a life so undeniable that the truth would never again need anyone's permission to exist. It would stand on its own. The first year after I left was the kind of year that either breaks you completely or burns away everything soft and leaves something harder behind. I was 18 years old, living in a 12 by 12 room in a shared house 3 miles from Vanderbilt's campus. For other tenants. 1 bathroom. A kitchen where someone always left dishes in the sink and nobody ever replaced the dish soap. I paid $380 a month, which took nearly everything I earned working 22 hours a week at a copy and print shop 2 bus rides away. I had enrolled at Nashville State on a partial academic scholarship. Not my first choice, not the 4-year university I'd been quietly planning toward since freshman year. But what was available, what was affordable, what was possible given that I was doing this entirely alone. I didn't tell anyone at school what had happened. I constructed a version of my life that was technically true and emotionally empty. My family and I aren't close. I'm pretty independent. People accepted it. Nobody pressed. Everyone in that copy shop and that shared house was carrying something they weren't fully explaining either. I didn't tell anyone at school what had happened. I constructed a version of my life that was technically true and emotionally empty. My family and I aren't close. I'm pretty independent. People accepted it. Nobody pressed. Everyone in that copy shop and that shared house was carrying something they weren't fully explaining either. It was in Knoxville that I found the law. I had been pre-law in a vague, aspirational way since high school. Drawn to it the way you're drawn to something you recognize without fully understanding why. But it was a single class in my junior year, a civil procedure course taught by a professor named Dr. Linda Marsh, that turned a direction into a calling. Dr. Marsh was the kind of teacher who made you feel the weight of what law actually was. Not rules on paper, not a career path, but a system of power that determined whose story got told and whose got buried. She had spent 15 years as a public defender before moving into academia, and she brought that history into every lecture like it was still alive in her. One afternoon she said something I wrote down and have never forgotten. The law doesn't care about the truth. It cares about what can be proven. Your job, if you choose this work, is to close that gap. I sat with that for days. Closing the gap between truth and proof. Between what actually happened and what the record shows. I thought about a church office in Nashville. A binder full of logged figures. Witnesses who were never asked a single question. A daughter who was never given the chance to present her case. I thought about my father walking to his office and closing the door. I enrolled in the pre-law honors track the following semester. I joined the mock trial team. I cold emailed 3 attorneys in Knoxville asking if I could shadow them on weekends, and one of them, a civil rights attorney named James Whitfield, said yes. James Whitfield changed the shape of my future. He ran a small firm that took cases nobody else wanted: wrongful termination, housing discrimination, due process violations. Cases where ordinary people had been steamrolled by institutions that counted on them not having the resources to fight back. He was meticulous, relentless, and completely unimpressed by credentials or connections. The only thing he respected was preparation. I showed up every Saturday for 8 months. I researched cases, organized files, sat in on client meetings, and said nothing unless asked. At the end of those 8 months, he offered me a part-time paid position and wrote me a law school recommendation letter that I still have saved on my laptop. "Maya Calloway," he wrote, "understands something most law students take years to learn: that the law is only as just as the people willing to fight for it. She will fight." I applied to Vanderbilt Law School, the same university 3 miles from the copy shop where I'd worked at 18, exhausted and invisible. I got in with a merit scholarship that covered 70% of my tuition. I didn't tell my parents. Not out of spite, or not only out of spite. I didn't tell them because I had slowly, painfully learned to stop needing their acknowledgement as fuel. Every time I had imagined sharing a milestone with them, I'd felt the old hunger rise up. The need for my father to nod with something more than indifference, for my mother to say "I'm proud of you" like she meant it. And every time I'd had to remind myself that feeding that hunger was a way of handing them power over my forward motion. So I stopped. I celebrated alone or with the small circle of friends I'd carefully built. I took myself to dinner the night I got my acceptance letter. I ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and sat there in a restaurant booth by myself and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Enough. Not happy exactly. Not healed. But enough. Like the foundation I was building was finally solid enough to stand on without shaking. Law school was 3 of the hardest years of my life, and also the 3 years I was most completely myself. I specialized in civil rights litigation. I clerked for a federal judge the summer after second year. I graduated in the top 8% of my class. By the time I passed the bar, first attempt, both sections, I had not spoken to my parents in nearly 7 years. Brandon had texted me once about 4 years after I left. "Hey. Hope you're good." I stared at that message for a long time. I typed back, "I am." That was the last contact I'd had with anyone named Calloway. I had built my life clean and deliberate, the way you build something when you know nobody is coming to help you. Brick by brick. Case by case. With the kind of focus that only comes from having absolutely nothing to fall back on. I was 28 years old, 18 months into my position at a civil rights firm in Washington, D.C., when my phone rang with a Tennessee area code. I almost didn't answer. I should have trusted that instinct. Let me tell you what 7 years of building a life from nothing actually looks like. Because it doesn't look like a montage. It doesn't look like a highlight reel. It looks like a Tuesday night at 11:30, sitting under a flickering fluorescent light in a law library, reading the same case brief for the 4th time because your brain is too tired to absorb it, but the exam is in 9 hours and tired is not an option you can afford. It looks like eating peanut butter crackers for dinner 3 nights in a row because you miscalculated your grocery budget and payday isn't until Friday. It looks like wearing the same 2 blazers on rotation for an entire semester of mock trial because professional clothing costs money you don't have. It looks like watching classmates take ski trips over winter break and saying, "I have plans," when what you mean is, "I have a shift." That was my silent grind. Unglamorous. Unwitnessed. Entirely mine. But here's what the grind also looked like. It looked like a federal judge, the Honorable Patricia Shinn of the Eastern District of Tennessee, telling me after my clerkship that I had the sharpest instinct for procedural strategy she had seen in a clerk in 11 years on the bench. It looked like James Whitfield, the attorney who had taken a chance on a cold email from a 20-year-old with no connections, calling me on the day I passed the bar and saying, "I always knew. First try both sections." Of course. It looked like the moment I walked into the offices of Hargrove and Bell in Washington, D.C., one of the most respected civil rights litigation firms in the country, and sat across from senior partner Claudia Hargrove for what I thought was a screening interview, and walked out 90 minutes later with a job offer. I had built something real. And I had built it in complete silence, invisible to the people who had decided I wasn't worth believing in. My practice at Hargrove and Bell focused on institutional due process violations, cases where organizations, schools, employers and government bodies had failed to give individuals fair process before making decisions that devastated their lives. Terminations without proper procedure. Expulsions based on unverified accusations. Benefits stripped without adequate notice or hearing. I want you to sit with the particular irony of that specialization for a moment. The girl who was condemned by her own family without a single question asked, without a single witness consulted, without so much as a conversation, had become the attorney people called when institutions did exactly that to them. When the process failed. When the accusation preceded the investigation. When someone's entire life was reorganized around a conclusion that was never actually proven. I understood my clients in a way that went beyond legal training. I understood them in my bones. In 18 months at the firm I had worked on 9 cases. We won 7. One was settled favorably out of court. One was still pending. Claudia Hargrove had already indicated I was on track for an accelerated path to senior associate, which in a firm of that caliber was not a thing said lightly. Outside of work, my life was deliberately constructed for stability and peace. I had a 1-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill that I had furnished slowly and intentionally. Nothing bought in a hurry, nothing kept out of obligation. Every object in that apartment was there because I had chosen it. Bookshelves that covered an entire wall, organized by subject and then by author. A kitchen where I actually cooked because cooking was the one thing that reliably slowed my brain down after 12-hour days. A small balcony where I kept 3 plants that I had managed against considerable odds to keep alive for 2 full years. I had 4 close friends, people I had accumulated carefully over a decade of being selective about who I let into the clean, hard-won space of my life. Renee, my law school roommate who was now a public defender in Baltimore and who understood without explanation why I didn't talk about my family. David, a policy analyst I'd met through a mutual friend, calm and funny and incapable of drama. Priya and Sam, a couple I'd met at a firm networking event who had somehow become the people I called when something went wrong and when something went right. These were my people. Not the people I was born to. The people I had chosen. I had not spoken to my parents in 7 years. I had not spoken to Brandon since that single text exchange 4 years prior. I had constructed my life with that absence built into the architecture. Not as a wound I was managing but as a boundary I had accepted. Some doors once closed on you, you learn to stop standing in front of. I won't tell you I never thought about them. There were moments, holiday dinners at Renee's family's house, watching her mother refill her plate without being asked and her father ask follow-up questions about her cases with genuine curiosity, where something would move through me that I didn't always have a name for. Not grief exactly. Not longing. Something more like the awareness of an absence. The recognition of a shape that should have been there and wasn't. But awareness is not the same as need. I had learned that distinction slowly and at some cost, and I held on to it carefully. My therapy helped. I want to say that plainly without dressing it up because I think there's still too much silence around it. I had been in therapy since my 2nd year of law school. A no-nonsense psychologist named Dr. Carol Estes who had a gift for identifying the exact moment I was rationalizing something I should be feeling instead. She was the one who helped me understand that what my parents had done wasn't just a mistake or a failure of judgment. It was a pattern. The rumor hadn't created their response. It had simply revealed the architecture that was already there. The one in which I was always the daughter whose account could be dismissed, whose truth was always slightly less credible, whose belonging was always slightly more conditional. Understanding that didn't make it hurt less. But it made the hurt make sense. and sense I had found was something I could work with. By the time that Tennessee area code appeared on my phone, I was not the 18-year-old girl who had sat on a bus bench in the February cold wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake by refusing to keep shrinking. I was 28 years old. I had a federal clerkship on my resume, 7 case wins in 18 months, and a senior partner who was already talking about my future at the firm in terms that made other associates visibly uncomfortable. I had built something. Quietly. Alone. Without a single word of encouragement from the people who were supposed to want that for me most. And I want you to understand something about that silence. The 7 years of it. It wasn't emptiness. It wasn't absence masquerading as strength. It was construction. Every day I didn't hear from them was a day I used to build something they hadn't given me permission to want. The call came on a Wednesday evening in March. I was at my kitchen counter, still in my work clothes, halfway through making pasta, case notes open on the counter beside me. My phone lit up. Tennessee area code. Nashville prefix. I stood there and watched it ring. 4 rings. On the 6th ring, something I cannot fully explain made me reach out and answer. Why, my mother's voice. Older. Tighter. The specific tension of someone who needs something and resents needing it. We need to talk. It's about your father. And just like that, 7 years of hard-won distance collapsed into a single kitchen, a pot of pasta going soft on the stove, and the voice I had spent the better part of a decade learning to live without. I want to tell you something about hearing a parent's voice after 7 years of silence. It doesn't hit you the way you expect it to. You spend years imagining what that moment would feel like. The anger, the coldness, the satisfaction of having become someone they couldn't ignore. You rehearse it in the shower, on long commutes, in the quiet moments before sleep when your brain refuses to fully power down. And then it actually happens and none of the rehearsals matter. Because the voice is just a voice. Familiar in a way that bypasses all your careful preparation and goes straight to somewhere much older than reason. I gripped my phone and said nothing for a moment. Why? Are you there? I'm here, I said. What's going on? My mother's voice was controlled in the way it always was when she was managing something. Diane Calloway did not fall apart in front of people, not even her estranged daughter on the phone at 7 in the evening. She organized her distress into sentences the way she organized everything else. Efficient. Sequential. Stripped of anything that might be interpreted as weakness. She told me the story in the order she had clearly prepared it. My father had been served with a civil lawsuit 3 weeks prior. A former business partner, a man named Gerald Pruitt, was suing him for breach of contract and fraud. My father had started a small investment venture with Pruitt 2 years after retiring from his insurance job. A real estate holding company that had apparently gone sideways in ways my mother was either unable or unwilling to fully detail over the phone. Pruitt was claiming my father had misrepresented the company's financial position, redirected funds without authorization, and effectively pushed him out of a business he had co-founded. The lawsuit was asking for $480,000 in damages. The attorney my father had initially hired, a general practice lawyer he knew from the Rotary Club, had reviewed the filing and told him plainly that this was outside his area of expertise. He needed a litigator. Someone who understood civil fraud claims, contract disputes, and the specific procedural landscape of federal civil court. My mother paused after laying all of this out. The pause had a shape to it. A direction. We were hoping, she said carefully, that you might be able to help. Or at least point us toward someone who could. I turned the burner off under the pasta. I set the wooden spoon down on the counter. Where did you hear I was an attorney? I asked. Another pause. Order. Brandon looked you up. About a year ago. He found your firm's website. So they had known for at least a year. They had known I was at Hargrove and Bell, that I was a civil rights litigator, that I had built exactly the kind of career that required exactly the kind of skill set they were now calling to access. They had known and said nothing, until they needed something. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because this story is about truth and I owe you the full version. Part of me felt the pull. That old, deep current that runs underneath everything when it comes to family. The one that says they're still your parents, they're scared you could fix this. I felt it. I won't pretend I didn't. But a larger, steadier part of me was watching the situation with the precise attention I brought to every case that crossed my desk. And what I was seeing was a pattern I recognized. They had not called to apologize. There was no preamble about the past, no acknowledgement of the 7 years. No, we've been thinking about what happened and we were wrong. My mother had moved directly from hello to the problem she needed solved, as efficiently as if she were calling a service provider. As if the account between us were simply inactive rather than in ruins. They needed a litigator. They happened to have one. The fact that she was the daughter they had put out in the February cold with $240 was, apparently, a separate matter to be addressed at some unspecified later time, or not addressed at all. I need some time to think about this, I told my mother. Of course, she said. And then, almost as an afterthought, the way you add something to an email you've already almost sent. Maya. Your father isn't well. Beyond the lawsuit. His heart. He had a procedure in January. It's been a hard year. She delivered this information in the same organized, controlled tone as everything else. But I heard what was underneath it. The thing she was actually deploying. The card she had held back until the practical argument hadn't produced an immediate yes. Your father is sick. Come back now. I told her I would call her by the end of the week. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time without moving. Then I called Renee. Renee, who had heard every version of the Calloway family story over 7 years of friendship, who had sat with me through the worst of it and never once told me what to do, listened to the whole phone call without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? She asked. I don't know yet, I said. Yes, you do, she said. You just don't want it yet. She wasn't wrong. I spent 3 days thinking about nothing else. I ran every scenario. I talked it through with Dr. Estes, who asked me the question she always asked when I was circling something. What would you advise a client in this situation? I thought about that. A client who had been wrongly accused, cast out, forced to build a life entirely alone, called back 7 years later not with an apology but with a request. What would I tell that client? I would tell her to move carefully. To gather information before making any commitments. To enter any engagement with her eyes fully open and her boundaries fully established in advance. So that's what I did. I called my mother back on Friday evening as promised. I told her I was willing to come to Nashville. Not to take the case, not yet. To review the filing, assess the situation and have a conversation in person. I told her I was coming as a professional evaluating a legal matter, and that any decisions about representation would be made on that basis and no other. My mother said, of course. We understand. She said it quickly. The way people say things when they've already decided the answer is yes and the conditions are just formalities to be managed. I booked a flight for the following Saturday. Window seat. 1 carry-on. I did not pack for more than a weekend. I want you to understand the state of mind I carried onto that plane. I was not going home. I had not had a home in Nashville since I was 18 years old. I was going to a city where my parents lived, to review a legal filing as a professional. I had boundaries. I had clarity. I had 7 years of therapy and hard-won distance between me and the girl who used to need something from these people. I had prepared for this. What I had not prepared for was walking through the arrivals terminal at Nashville International and seeing my father standing at the bottom of the escalator. Not my mother. My father. Robert Calloway, who had walked to his office and closed the door the night I told him I was innocent. Who had not called once in 7 years. Who had apparently recovered enough from his heart procedure to drive to the airport. He looked older. Smaller, somehow, in the way people do when you've been carrying a larger version of them in your memory. His hair was fully gray now. He was holding his car keys in both hands the way people hold things when they don't know what to do with their hands. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You look good, Maya." And I understood in that instant exactly what I was walking into. This was not a legal consultation. This was a trap built out of need and love and years of silence. And I had boarded a plane and flown straight into it with my eyes open. The question was what I was going to do now that I was here. The Calloway family home looked exactly the same. That was the first thing that struck me as my father pulled into the driveway. The same brick exterior. The same wraparound porch. The flagpole in the front yard, flag perfectly positioned. The lemon tree my father had planted was bigger now, sprawling past the fence line in a way that suggested nobody had trimmed it in years. But everything else was exactly as I had left it a decade ago, preserved with the particular stubbornness of people who mistake stillness for stability. My mother was waiting at the door. She looked at me the way my father had at the airport, searching, recalibrating, adjusting the image she had been carrying against the person standing in front of her. I was not the 18-year-old girl in a second-hand coat anymore. I was wearing a wool blazer that had cost more than my first month's rent in that shared house in Nashville. I had a leather portfolio under my arm. I stood the way litigators learn to stand, grounded, unhurried, taking up exactly the space I was entitled to. He said, "Come in." I made coffee. I said, "Thank you." We sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had told me, "We know what you did, Maya," and my father laid out the documents. The original partnership agreement between him and Gerald Pruitt. The amended operating agreement from 18 months in. The demand letter. The federal civil complaint. I read everything without speaking. My parents sat across from me and waited. The case was serious. I could see that within the first 10 minutes. Pruitt's attorneys had constructed a tight narrative. My father had brought him in as a co-founder, accepted his capital contribution of $240,000, and then systematically marginalized him from operational decisions before restructuring the company in a way that diluted his ownership stake to near zero. The fraud claim rested on a series of financial disclosures my father had made during the formation period that Pruitt alleged were materially false. The contract claim was cleaner and more dangerous. There was a clause in the original partnership agreement, one my father had apparently signed without fully understanding its implications, that gave Pruitt specific audit rights and required unanimous consent for any structural changes to the company. My father had made those changes unilaterally. I set the complaint down and looked at my father. "Did you make these changes without telling him?" My father's jaw tightened. "It's more complicated than that." "I'm sure it is," I said. "But did you make structural changes to the company without Pruitt's written consent?" Pause. "Yes." "And did you provide him with the financial disclosures listed in Exhibit C before he made his capital contribution?" Another pause. Longer. "We gave him a summary," my mother said. I looked at her. "A summary is not a disclosure, Mom." The word Mom landed in the room like something physical. I hadn't planned to say it. It had come out of the machinery of the conversation before I could intercept it. And now it was just sitting there on the kitchen table between us, next to the partnership agreement and the coffee cups. Nobody acknowledged it. We moved on. I spent 2 hours going through everything. I asked questions. I took notes. I was thorough in the way that had become second nature. Not because I had decided to take the case, but because I was constitutionally incapable of reviewing a legal situation halfway. By the time I closed my portfolio, I had a clear picture of where things stood. My father's position was defensible. Not comfortably, not easily, but defensible. The fraud claim had vulnerabilities. The financial disclosures, while incomplete, weren't demonstrably false. And Pruitt's own conduct during the partnership included irregularities that could be used to complicate his narrative. The contract claim was harder, but there was an argument to be made around course of dealing and implied consent that a skilled litigator could develop into something workable. It was exactly the kind of case I was good at. And sitting at that kitchen table, I understood with complete clarity that my parents understood that too. That this was precisely why I was here. Not because I was their daughter. But as I was useful. I looked at my father. Before I tell you where I think this case stands, I said, I need to say something. And I need you both to hear it completely before you respond. My mother folded her hands on the table. My father looked at me steadily. 10 years ago, I said, you made a decision about me based on something someone told you in a parking lot. You didn't ask me a single question. You didn't speak to a single witness. You didn't request any documentation or verify any facts. You made a determination about your daughter's character and you acted on it, permanently, without conducting anything resembling a fair process. The kitchen was very quiet. I have spent the last 10 years building a career, I continued, that is entirely dedicated to fighting for people who were denied exactly that. Fair process. The right to present their side. The right to have the evidence examined before the verdict is delivered. I paused. I wanted the irony to fully land. And now you're sitting across from me with a federal civil complaint. A complaint that is fundamentally about whether Robert Calloway gave his business partner fair process and full disclosure before making decisions that affected him, and you're asking me to help you. My father's eyes dropped to the table. My mother said nothing. But something in her face shifted. A micro-movement around the eyes and jaw that I recognized after a lifetime of studying it, as the expression she made when she knew she had no good argument and was deciding whether to attempt one anyway. She decided against it. We were wrong, my father said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this and was now delivering it, and who understood the difference between those two things but was doing it anyway because it was what the moment required. About the money. About how we handled it. About all of it. I looked at him for a long moment. I know, I said. Not it's okay. Not I forgive you. Not the absolution they may have been hoping for. Just the plain acknowledgement that yes, they were wrong and yes, I had always known it and yes, we were both sitting here in the ruins of a decade that didn't have to happen. I'm not going to take your case, I said. My mother's breath caught slightly. Not because I can't, I said. I can. The case is defensible and I would probably win it. But I have a conflict of interest that goes beyond legal ethics. I cannot be your attorney. What I can do is refer you to someone I trust completely. A colleague at a firm in Nashville who specializes in exactly this kind of civil litigation. She's excellent. She will give your case everything it deserves. I opened my portfolio and wrote down a name and number on a clean sheet of paper. I slid it across the table to my father. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. That's it, he said. Not accusatory. Genuinely uncertain. That's it, I said. That's what I came here to do. What happened next I had not planned for. Brandon walked through the back door. He had clearly been told I was coming. His expression wasn't surprised, but it was careful in the way faces get when someone has been coached on how to behave in a delicate situation. He was 30 now. Broader than I remembered. Still had my father's handshake energy, that ease in a room that I had never possessed and had long since stopped envying. He looked at me and said, "Hey, Maya." I said, "Hey." And then he said something I had not expected from anyone in that house that day. I looked into it. A few years ago. The fundraiser thing. I talked to someone who was on the committee. The kitchen went very still. It was Karen Pruitt, he said. Gerald Pruitt's wife. She was the one who told Mom and Dad. Her daughter had wanted the volunteer position. She made the whole thing up. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that house. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father closed his eyes. And I sat at the kitchen table where my childhood had ended, holding 10 years of vindication in both hands, and felt something I had not expected. Not triumph. Relief. Just relief. The specific, exhausting relief of a truth that had always existed finally entering the record. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Brandon. And I meant it. I flew back to Washington, D.C. the next morning. Sunday flight. Window seat. Same carry-on I had packed for a weekend because that's all it was ever going to be. I watched Nashville shrink beneath the clouds and felt the particular clarity that comes after something long and heavy has finally been set down. I want to tell you what I did not do, because I think it matters as much as what I did. I did not reconcile with my parents. I did not move back. I did not fold the 10 years into a conversation at a kitchen table and call it resolved. I did not allow my father's quiet, "we were wrong," or my brother's belated discovery of the truth to retroactively rewrite what those years had actually cost me. The cold February morning at 18. The payphone call my mother had ended with a period instead of a question. The 7 years of building entirely alone while they lived 12 minutes from the copy shop where I had worked double shifts to pay rent. Those things happened. An apology, however genuine, does not unhappen them. And I was done pretending otherwise to make other people comfortable. What I did do was leave the door open. Slightly. Deliberately. On my own terms. Before I left the next morning, I sat with my father in the living room for about 20 minutes while my mother made breakfast neither of us would fully eat. He looked tired in the way people look when a hard year has settled permanently into their face. The heart procedure. The lawsuit. The decade of distance from a daughter he had chosen not to fight for. He didn't try to fill the silence with justifications. I respected that. At some point he said, "I don't expect anything from you, Maya. I want you to know that. We don't expect anything." I nodded. "I know. But I hope," he said carefully, "that maybe, over time." He didn't finish the sentence. Maybe he didn't know how. Maybe he understood that finishing it was my decision, not his, and for the first time in his life he was going to let me make it without pressure. I said, "Maybe. Over time." And I meant it as exactly what it was. Not a promise, not a door swinging open, but a single window cracked an inch, through which air could eventually move if everyone chose carefully enough. That was all I had. That was all I was willing to give. And for the first time in my relationship with my father, he accepted what I offered without asking for more. I hugged my mother briefly at the door. She held on a second longer than I expected. I let her. I did not cry on the way to the airport. I did not cry on the plane. I got home, unpacked my carry-on, watered my 3 plants on the balcony, and made the pasta I had abandoned on Wednesday evening. I sat at my kitchen counter and ate it slowly, in the quiet of my own apartment, in the life I had built from nothing in the city I had chosen, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had become without their help. And I felt underneath everything, underneath the complexity and the grief and the relief and the anger that would probably never fully dissolve, I felt free. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of free. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just sits there in the ordinary Tuesday evening texture of your life and reminds you gently and consistently that you made it. That you built something real. That the people who couldn't see your worth did not get to determine it. My colleague Sarah Chin took my parents' case. She's one of the best civil litigators in Tennessee and I trusted her completely with it. I am not their attorney and I never will be. That boundary is not punitive, it's just honest. Some roles are not available to me in that relationship, and attorney-client is one of them. The case is ongoing. I don't track it closely. It's not my business anymore. What is my business is the work I do every day for people who know exactly what it feels like to be condemned without a fair process. People who were fired based on rumors. Expelled based on accusations. Denied benefits based on paperwork that nobody bothered to verify. People who walked into systems that were supposed to protect them and found those systems had already made up their minds. I stand up in courtrooms for those people. I close the gap between truth and proof the way Dr. Marsh told me to. I do it with everything I have, every single time because I know what it costs when nobody does. That is what my parents gave me. Not intentionally. Not generously. But the thing that was supposed to destroy me became the thing that defined me. And I have made my peace with that particular irony. Now I want to talk to you directly. If you've watched this far, I don't think it's because you just wanted to see how my story ended. I think it's because some part of this story lives in you too. Maybe you were the one who was blamed for something you didn't do. Maybe you were the scapegoat, the one the family organized its problems around so nobody had to look at the real source of them. Maybe you were cut off, pushed out, or quietly demoted from full personhood in a family that smiled perfectly in photographs. Maybe you built something anyway. Maybe you're still in the middle of building it, and some days it feels like construction in the dark, one brick at a time with no blueprint and nobody watching. I want you to hear this clearly. The people who refuse to give you the benefit of the doubt are not the authors of your story. They were characters in the early chapters. Significant ones whose actions shaped the plot in ways you're still working through. But they do not hold the pen. You hold the pen. And here is what I know from 10 years of building a life that nobody handed me. The most powerful thing you can do for yourself is not revenge. It's not waiting for the apology. It's not the moment they finally see what they threw away. Though that moment may come, and when it does, you'll feel the relief of it in ways you can't fully anticipate. The most powerful thing you can do is build something so true to who you are that their opinion of you becomes genuinely irrelevant. Not performatively irrelevant. Not "I don't care" said through gritted teeth. Actually, deeply, structurally irrelevant. The kind of irrelevant that only comes when you have filled the space their absence left with something real and chosen and entirely yours. That's the work. It's slow. It's unglamorous. It happens in copy shops and law libraries and one-bedroom apartments where you eat pasta alone and water your plants and go to bed early because tomorrow requires everything you have. But it's yours. Every single brick of it is yours. And nobody, not a parking lot rumor, not a closed office door, not $240 handed over without eye contact, can take that from you. If this story resonated with you, if some part of it felt familiar in a way you didn't expect, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, told without flinching for people who were counted out and kept going anyway. And drop a comment. Tell me where you are in your story. Are you still in the grind? Have you had your kitchen table moment? Are you somewhere in between, carrying something heavy and moving forward anyway? I read every single one. Because the most important thing I learned in 10 years of building a life from nothing is this: you don't have to do it in complete silence. There are people out here who understand. People who have sat on the same cold bus benches and made the same quiet decision to build something undeniable. You're not alone in that. And you never were.